In this segment, I'll focus on the Pareto principle, more commonly referred to as the 80-20 rule. The principle was named after the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, who developed it initially by observing that 20% of the pea pods in his garden produced 80% of the peas. Pareto later completed his landmark analysis of Italian real estate ownership, which confirmed that 80% of Italian land was owned by just 20% of the population. Curious, he conducted similar surveys in other countries and found to his surprise that a similar distribution applied. In the business context, the 80-20 rule suggests that 80% of our sales are being generated by just 20% of our customers, with the implication being that some customers are much more valuable than others and should garner a much larger share of our attention. To bring this concept to life, I'll introduce 4 different examples. All 4 come from the pharmaceutical industry, and I've chosen this industry because the customer-level data that's available provides very clear insight into the level of sales concentration that exists. Now, one common method of thinking about our customers is to place them in deciles based on their potential for using our products. In this example, we're looking at a diabetes brand in the US market, and we've segmented our physician customers into 10 deciles of equal value. What makes decile 10 customers different from decile 1 customers is that it takes only 708 customers in decile 10, generating 3,912 prescriptions per year, to generate our first 10% of business. In contrast, in our decile 1 segment, it takes 242,000 customers, producing just 11 prescriptions per year, to generate that final 10% of our business. So clearly that's why decile 10 customers are so much more valuable to us. But I'd like to refer back to the 80-20 rule, and I want to focus your attention on the 5th column moving from left to right, where you can see that 80% of cumulative prescriptions are being generated by just 6.5% of our total customer universe. So think back to the 80-20 rule. In this particular category, we can see that it's far more concentrated than 80-20. In fact, if we focus just one row lower, we might think of it as the 90-10 rule for this particular category. And again, it's crucial that we understand these dynamics because we want to invest disproportionate resources in those customers who are so much more valuable to us at the top of the pyramid. We really want to starve some of those customers at the bottom of the pyramid who we invest lots of resources in to cover, but who produce relatively little for us in the end. Another example comes from the leading brand in the osteoporosis category. For those of you not familiar with osteoporosis, it's a disease that leads to fragile bones in older women and sometimes results in fractures. So in this category, we see that 80% of cumulative prescriptions are being generated again by about 6.5% of the total customer universe, very similar to our last example. In our next example, we'll focus on the US antibiotic market, and here we'll see an even higher level of concentration. We'll see, for example, that 80% of cumulative prescriptions are being generated by just 5 to 6% of our total customer universe. So again, a much higher concentration than the 80-20 rule would imply. Our final example relates to a personal experience that I had working as a new sales rep in the launch of a product called Cardura early in my career. Cardura is a drug for high blood pressure. It was launched in late 1990 into an extremely crowded and competitive category of more than 60 different drugs, all of which had relatively similar levels of efficacy. Cardura was, by all accounts, a me-too entry into the least desirable class of high blood pressure drugs, and they were less desirable because they had a very rapid onset of action that resulted in fainting in some patients. So it didn't take a crystal ball to predict that Cardura would struggle and struggle mightily to gain a foothold in this crowded marketplace. A further challenge that I didn't anticipate was that my predecessor had neglected Cardura during the initial 5 months post-launch and left me climbing out of a pretty deep hole. I began my journey at 16% achievement of target in May of 1991 and got to work trying to convince my 75 customers to increase their usage of Cardura. Fortunately for me, some of them bought in and helped me finish the year at 63% of my goal, still a far cry from where I needed to be, but a far cry better than where I began. And that's when things got really interesting. My 1992 Cardura sales target was increased by 216% over a target that I couldn't even hit in 1991. And it became clear to me that a major change in my approach was needed if I had any hope of hitting my target in the new year. So I threw caution to the wind and decided to focus on the 10 customers who had already begun prescribing Cardura. I got my call frequency from 1 to 2 calls per month, figured out exactly how many patients I would need to hit my goal, and then asked each of these 10 customers for a very firm commitment during the first week of January to begin building some much needed momentum. In the end, the results exceeded my wildest expectations. I beat my target by 35% and learned a very valuable lesson related to the 80-20 rule. The key lesson is that it takes very few customers in the end to achieve even the most significant stretch target. I began by focusing on 10 physicians with my high-frequency hard closing campaign, but in the end, only about 5 of these customers actually followed through and began prescribing Cardura with any level of consistency. So, out of an initial target list of 75 customers, just 5 generated virtually 100% of my sales, a far greater concentration than even the 80-20 rule would imply. In summary, the overwhelming majority of our business is generated by a relatively small group of our customers. Our tendency is to cast our promotional nets very broadly, but this is a mistake that we need to avoid because it undermines not only our competitiveness, but destroys profitability as we invest vast resources pursuing customers that have relatively little potential for using our products. Finally, it's the smart companies that invest disproportionate resources in serving the needs of their most valuable customers, and these choices are almost always reflected in higher valuations in the marketplace.